Hello, I'm Alex Norwick, and today I'm truly honored to be joined by Dawn Moore, the daughter of Clayton Moore, the Lone Ranger. Dawn, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Alex, for having me and finding me in the parking lot.
Sure thing. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Now, fans remember Clayton Moore as the Lone Ranger, the masked man who thundered across the plains on a silver-white stallion. But for you, his daughter, what memories stand out?
There was no white stallion at home. There were no planes. We lived in the San Fernando Valley, and honestly, what stands out for me, my father had an incredible sense of humor. He was just basically a big kid, so he loved to play. He was a wonderful friend, but he was still a father. He knew the difference between the two. But he understood children, loved children. So as a dad, playmate, fun.
And as the Lone Ranger himself, fans very much remember Clayton Moore as the Lone Ranger, his star as Clayton Moore, the Lone Ranger. What stands out about him just as an individual, as a man, Clayton Moore?
Do you know why his star has Clayton Moore, the Lone Ranger?
No, why is that?
And it is the only star on the entire Walk of Fame with the name of the actor and the character.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I will answer the rest of your question as well.
Oh.
But Rick Dees actually nominated Dad. And at the time, you had to be nominated. Today, of course, you can buy it. But, and when he filled out the application, Rick filled out the application, that's what he put. He put Clayton Moore, the Lone Ranger. And nobody questioned it, and they just put that on the star. So there it is.
Wow.
Kind of a funny accident, but perfect.
And now he's the only one.
And now he's the only one, as he is in so many other ways.
Sure.
What stands out about him as a person? Integrity, and that's very much true of him as a person. And that transcended the character for sure. But he was adamant about being honest. Both, again, as a parent and as a father, he encouraged honesty and didn't punish me for, make me afraid to come to him to tell him the truth. Mm-hmm. But he appreciated that in other people. So that's everything, really. Right? What else is there? Character.
Mm-hmm. And Franz Stryker, the creator of the Lone Ranger, wrote the Lone Ranger Creed. And your father wrote in his autobiography that the creed and playing the role of the Lone Ranger changed his life. Why is that?
I think that my father understood the power of the character. When he first read the script, and I'm going to share something that probably was not necessarily at the top of his mind when he first was handed the script, but he looked at the script in 1949. At that point, his oldest brother was dead. His father was dead. He had come from some adversity in his home life. And he saw a script where he, the character, saved people, right? But he also read a script where the lead character avenged his dead brother's death, right? So as the single ranger who survived the ambush, John Reed, which is the Lone Ranger's name, actually, let's put this puppy back on. Actually, well, there we go.
There we go.
All right.
Perfect.
John Reed cut a mask out of his dead brother's vest to wear and to avenge his brother's death. So my father was handed that script at a point in his life that was very pivotal. He had been working very hard and for many, many years at Republic Studios. At that point, he really was the king of the cliffhangers. He had actually not made more, but he starred in more than Buster Crabbe had, which many people don't know. And the producer of The Lone Ranger, George Trendle, saw him as the ghost of Zorro. And there was my father with a mask covering all of his face except those piercing blue eyes.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how he was called in for the role. But after he came in and he read for it, George Frendel at the end of this interview said, "Mr. Moore, would you like the role of the Lone Ranger?" And my father turned to him and said, "Mr. Trendle, I am the Lone Ranger." So you know that he had seen something in that character that spoke to him right away, obviously. I mean, obviously he connected immediately with it.
And your father always conducted himself as the Lone Ranger when he was in public. He always stood up straight. He spoke with a clear voice. He was very patriotic. Why do you believe that he took the character so seriously even while he was in public?
He understood very clearly the power that the character had over his audience in a good way. And to your point earlier, you'd said that he was often quoted as saying that he fell in love with the character and that it made him a better person. He did. He reached up to the tenets of the creed, and they're not easy. I mean, they're pretty lofty. But he felt that did make him a better person, and he saw that the children that looked up to him actually emulated him, right? Which is still true today. Children emulate their heroes, but not everyone really takes seriously their role or their potential influence over a young life. And my father understood that inherently, that he was able to form these children's lives with opinions that were going to last them a lifetime.
Your father started off actually as an acrobat growing up in the Midwest. He was a very talented acrobat, which led to doing stunt work here in Hollywood. After the series concluded for the Lone Ranger, you look at Clayton Moore, he still looked very much like the Lone Ranger. So how did he maintain a healthy and active lifestyle?
He was a natural athlete. My father was actually also in the 1934 Chicago World's Fair as a catcher in a trapeze act. Now, catchers have to be strong, right? Mm-hmm. He naturally loved sports, and he was naturally good at sports. So even after the show was off the air, you know, he was still making personal appearances and going on the road as the Lone Ranger, and of course needed to fit in that costume. He didn't have different sizes of costume. That same costume fit him for 50 years. Wow. Think about it.
Right.
That wouldn't have fit me for 5 weeks.
Oh.
I mean, that would have been over. But he, I'm not even going to say he walked every day, because that's not heavy exercise enough. He swam every day. He played tennis. I mean, he actually was very active, and he went out of his way to find things to do because he enjoyed it. He liked being outside and outdoors. I mean, he actually would go on weekends and go camping. Oh my God, there's this great story when we lived in Calabasas, on Lake Calabasas,
wow,
that he was sitting outside on his patio, and he heard these little girls crying for help, and he went and looked to see what was going on, and these two little girls had gotten in a boat and had floated off into the middle of the lake,
oh no,
and, you know, didn't know how to get back. And so he jumped in, swam out to get them, towed them back, and of course they went home and told their parents, but they didn't know who, right? Mm-hmm. So classic Lone Ranger, right?
Sure.
Wasn't able to thank him, right? Kid swooped in, saved the day, we weren't able to thank him. And of course the parents went, well, who was this? And they're like, they're little, we don't know, some tall, whatever they said. And it ran in the newspaper, and Dad kind of stepped forward because he didn't want the parents to freak out, right? So he told the parents that it was him. Oh. And, it's so classic. Doesn't happen to everybody that there's an opportunity to jump in and save people.
Sure.
But it seemed to happen to him a lot. He seemed to be in those situations quite often. Mm. But the difference is, he was able to actually do it based on your question, mm-hmm. kept himself physically fit. So it's one thing to be in a situation where someone needs help, and you know that they do, but maybe you have to call 911 to get somebody to help. or be able to do it yourself.
Right.
Right? And Dad was always in a position where he could do it himself. And he did.
And the Lone Ranger's companion, Tonto, portrayed by Jay Silverheels, also an incredible athlete, just a terrific horseman like Clayton. Clayton Moore said of Jay Silverheels that he was very honored to be called Kimosabe, trusty scout. And what was your father's relationship with Jay Silverheels like?
Dad had tremendous respect for Jay. And this is something that I think is really important for the record, because, well, first of all, everybody, hopefully everyone knows that. He always took every opportunity to thank Jay and to acknowledge him whenever Dad was being honored. He would always honor Jay first, including when he got his star on the Walk of Fame. The first thing he said was he thanked Jay. But, you know, Jay had a very different life experience. He did grow up as the son of a chief, an elder, and I'm not going to say privileged is the wrong word. He had a life where he was able to understand respect and be looked at as part of a larger culture that was respected. So think about the 1950s in America. Probably not a whole lot different than it is now, sadly, but maybe a little bit worse. Jay got a lot of grief on the set, and Jay would not put up with it. But he was extremely dignified, but he took care of himself. Jay was a Golden Gloves boxer. And there was an incident where one of the crew members came by and said, "How you doing there, Chief?" And Jay turned around and decked him, laid him out flat, knocked him out cold.
Wow.
And Dad just stepped over the guy, and then Dad and Jay just went on to set and carried on with their with filming, because he absolutely stood in solidarity with Jay. I mean, there were several situations where Jay had to stand up for himself, or Dad would also, you know, back him and step in. But tremendous respect, because he saw that there was someone who was walking the walk. Jay was an activist for making sure that American Indians got Indian roles, right? The Native Americans at that time, of course, you know, were portrayed by lots of white people with a lot of red makeup and horrible wigs and all of that. Jay was an advocate and actually created the American Indians Actors Workshop, or it could have been Indians Actor Workshop. Oh, for God's sakes. Okay. You'll look it up. You'll cut all this out and fix it and go back and make it right. But anyway, or not. And I can just look like an idiot. It's fine. But he was very, very proud of that, and he changed a lot of actors' lives. So my father, you know, really looked up to Jay. I mean, he looked at Jay as a role model in an entirely different way, because of course my father, you know, grew up privileged and white, so he didn't have those obstacles to have to overcome. So he watched someone who did it with dignity.
And I recall your father saying that when he met Jay Silverheels, he was a bit of a trickster, and that they kind of would have some fun times together. Did you ever experience your father being kind of a big little kid at all?
Oh my God, yeah. You know, in those days too, everybody had nicknames. You know, my father was one of those people who had a nickname for everybody. Yeah, they like to play jokes. They like to have a good time. Never mean-spirited. And see, this is something that's kind of different, right? There was a camaraderie, but also a sense of humor about where you were, who you were, where you came from. You know, the difference with that era, and I would think that if you spoke to Kirk Douglas, who's still alive, 102, I think he just turned 102, these people had to actually do the job. And what I mean by that is not just as actors, They had to haul cable. They had to move the lights. This was the dawn of television. There were no unions. There were no, there were stunt people, but honestly, they hired people that could do everything because there wasn't a lot of money. So these guys did their own stunts. They hauled their own stuff. A lot of them put on their own makeup. They shared dressing rooms. Sometimes there wasn't even a dressing room. I mean, there were many stories that Dad shared with me about not having dressing rooms out in Chatsworth, and it was extremely hot and dusty and dirty, and they're having to put on my father's suit. That costume was wool, and it was very heavy and very hot. And Jay's costume, by the way, was actual suede. It was leather.
Wow.
So this is not, it's not it was not glamorous stuff, is my point. But so that said, to answer your question, there was tremendous camaraderie because they worked their asses off. And they sweat together, and nobody was above anybody else. Nobody said, I'm not doing that job. That's not my job. Everybody did everything, and I think that we see that when we work together like that, we just have a closer bond.
And as we wrap up here, what would you say is the legacy of your father, Clayton Moore, the Lone Ranger?
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that question. And I would say that my father's legacy, well, I do want to share with you the Lone Ranger Creed, which I brought, and I think that's an important thing, but I'll wrap up with that if I may. My father's legacy really lies in the fan letters that he got during his lifetime, and I continue to get to this day, from policemen and firemen and teachers and actually even spiritual leaders who all say that they chose a career of service because of his example as a man, and not just his example as an actor, how he conducted himself personally. That's powerful stuff. To inspire people to serve others, that's his legacy. I think that's a really, really important moment for him, and it continues to this day. I have policemen coming up to me very often, and when they know who I am, of course, not just randomly on the street, because then I'd be doing something wrong. But anyway, saying that I became a police officer. I went into law enforcement because of your father, and it brings me to tears. It's very important, and same thing with spiritual leaders, that they would say I've gone into the ministry because I want to guide people. People look at my father as their father, or as the father that they wished that they had. That's kind of big stuff, right?
It is.
May I read the creed?
I'd be glad to, yeah.
I should almost let you read the creed, actually, but...
Oh, let's hear it.
Okay. I believe that to have a friend, a man must be one, that all men are created equal, and that everyone has within himself the power to help make this a better world. That God put the firewood there, but man must gather and light it himself. In being prepared physically, mentally, and morally to fight when necessary for that which is right. I believe that a man should make the most of what equipment he has, that this government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall live forever. That men should live by the rule of what is best for the greatest number, and that sooner or later, somewhere, somehow, we must settle with the world and make payment for what we have taken. That all things change but the truth, and that truth alone lives on forever. Timeless, right?
Very timeless indeed.
And timely.
Timely as well, you're right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insight on your father, Clayton Moore, the Lone Ranger. I'd be very glad to share with you, actually, an encounter I had with your father. I guess you could say it's a bit of a distant encounter.
Oh, fine, okay.
When I was 5 years old, my father had purchased a VHS of the Lone Ranger, and I watched it constantly. Fell in love with the Lone Ranger, and one day a magazine came to my home, and you could purchase a customized autograph from the Lone Ranger himself. And I was 5 years old. I couldn't purchase anything. So I called up the magazine. I said, hello, my name is Alex. I'd like the address for the Lone Ranger. And they said, the Lone Ranger? And I said, yes, Mr. Clayton Moore. And they said, okay. And they gave me the address. And so I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back to me. And this is what he said. He said, Dear Alex, howdy, partner. I received your letter, and I'm downright thrilled to know I still have such a fan out there in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Just when I thought I was a desperado with no sidekicks to ride with, you came along and reassured me there's still a few wild buckaroos roaming the plains. It's truly great to hear from an authentic Rough Rider like yourself. We're a rare breed nowadays. So Alex, keep galloping on them ponies, tossing that lasso, and blazing new trails. And you'll be a full-grown cowboy before you know it. Your buddy, the Lone Ranger. Hi-yo, Silver, away!
Good job. That's very sweet. That's very sweet. They gave you the address?
They gave me the address.
Wow, okay.
It happened.
I love that. That's beautiful.
Great.
And it's great that you saved it.
It's an honor. Thank you, Dawn.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and it's important stuff to share, and thank you for letting me share it.
Certainly. That's it from Studio A at the USC Annenberg School. Along with Dawn Moore, I'm Alex Norwick. Thanks for watching.